Yeah, hopefully not playing a cheater this time. Omega chilling, 1886. All right, let's go e4. c5 and another Smith Morra. That's how the last game started. Let's hope the result here will be a little bit different. c3. Okay, another accepted Smith Morra. Okay, so Mark told me that you basically want to go knight f3 before bishop c4 in most of these positions. So we want to start by developing our knights, then we put the bishop on c4, and the move e6 is very, very topical. It's one of the main moves in the position. And it's, black has not decided on a particular setup yet, right? We basically need to wait for black to show their cards. The way to do that is to develop as flexibly as possible with a move like knight f3. Okay, so we play knight f3. Now there's a bunch of moves that black has. a6, bishop b4 I know is a move. Black can play d6 and transpose back into the main line. Okay, so a6. Now, this is a position which we've discussed on several occasions because the correct move here, as far as I remember, is one that you wouldn't necessarily be inclined to play if you aren't experienced in this position. So if you aren't experienced in this position, I think a lot of you might be tempted to go bishop f4 and say, well, let's try to put the bishop on d6, right, and occupy that weak square. The problem with bishop f4, as far as I know, is that black goes d6. And then the bishop is a little bit awkward on f4. It could potentially walk into the move e5 with tempo. So despite principles, you actually want to go bishop c4 here. Now, again, why are we biting on granite, right? This looks like the least appetizing square for the bishop. But if you've watched my previous speedruns, you might remember that there was a Smith Morra game in which we had this line. And I don't know this line too well myself, so disclaimer, I might mess up the theory. But essentially, the point of bishop c4 is to prepare a knight sacrifice a little bit further down the road. And that knight sacrifice is knight c3 to d5. And you can kind of visualize a scenario where that knight sacrifice is very strong. Once we castle, and especially if we put a rook on e1, putting a knight on d5 is basically what makes this position tick. So that bishop, in a way, supports the knight that will later go to d5 in most lines. The other thing to realize is that a lot later down the line, once black castles, we don't have to stick to c4. And we can reposition the bishop to the b1, h7 diagonal later on down the line. Bishop e7. Okay, bishop e7, I don't really know. This doesn't look like a particularly independent move because black is probably going to end up developing one of his knights on the next move. So it's way too early for knight d5, right? We haven't developed any of our pieces yet. So sacrificing here makes absolutely no... Actually, it makes a little bit of sense. Or maybe it does make some sense. Knight d5, e takes d5. We have queen takes d5, threatening checkmate on f7. And it's very hard for black to stop that threat. So knight d5 is, believe it or not, quite interesting. But I think it's not really in the spirit of the position. And I think we should prepare it by castling. I think we should be patient. Because remember, after knight d5, black does not have to take that knight. Okay, so black has played d6, which is essentially a transposition into a line that I'm a little bit more familiar with. Now, you might remember from the previous game in which we faced the cheater, but still, what is the proper configuration in this position? How should we proceed? And if you don't know this particular setup, then it's hard to play this position properly. Essentially, you need to switch places. The queen spot is prime real estate. It's absolute prime real estate because black's queen on d8 doesn't have a clear place to go. And so what you need to do here is move the queen out of the way. And you want to keep it centralized, right? You don't want to move it to like b3. You want to keep it centralized and you want to make sure that it's protecting the bishop. And then you want to reposition the rook from f1 to d1 in order to x-ray black's queen and put pressure on the weak d6 pawn. That's kind of the logic behind this setup. Now, a lot of you are like, but wait a minute. Isn't b5 an annoying idea here? Don't we want to play a4 in such positions to prevent b5? Well, remember that when you sacrifice a pawn, the role that time plays is generally a lot more central. You don't have time to waste on positional niceties. And in this case, b5 is not scary. It may look annoying, but you just drop your bishop back to b3. Don't be fooled by moves that create one-move threats. You just move back to b3, and the quote-unquote initiative is over. The other problem with a4 is that it creates a hole on b4, which black could later potentially occupy with a knight, for instance. But also not a big deal, but not something you want to do voluntarily. Okay, so knight d7 I'm not familiar with. I'm only familiar with knight b8 to c6. I don't think we have to vary our play against knight d7. I think we can continue in exactly the same way that we would normally continue. So I think we should go rook d1 and position our rook on the best possible square and put pressure on d6, queen c7. Okay, so this is somewhat passive play by our opponent. I don't think black is doing anything terribly wrong, but I think he's getting himself into a very dubious position. So we have not completed our development, and we need to figure out where we want our bishop. Where do we want our bishop? Well, as many of you are indicating, you want the bishop on f4. Why do you want the bishop on f4? Doesn't it walk into e5? Well, because black is so passive, the move e5 comes with a very, very hefty price tag, right? e5 creates a gaping hole on d5, and especially since black put his queen on c7, knight d5 will actually come with tempo. So we want to play bishop f4 in order to put more pressure on d6, and we actually want to provoke black into playing e5 so that the diagonal for our other bishop is opened, and so that we get this massive outpost on d5. Now, we could have also played bishop e3. There wasn't anything specifically wrong with that move. I think bishop e3 was also quite decent, but bishop f4 has a lot more pizzazz to it. Okay, so knight f6, knight gf6. How should we continue, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we should continue putting pieces on good squares. Now, I know a lot of you are very tempted by the move e5, but e5 is the kind of move that might look very, very good, but you have to calculate it. You can't just play a move like that and expect that it works. What happens if we play e5? Well, if we play e5, black will take on e5, white will recapture with the pawn, black will play knight takes e5, we take with the bishop, and then black moves his queen up to a5, for example. So we don't actually accomplish as much as it seems with the move e5. We need to prepare it. And we need to prepare it by bringing all of our pieces into the game. We need to prepare it by bringing all of our pieces into the game. Rook a1 to c1 is very natural because we create an x-ray against his queen. But maybe e5 is good. I don't really know the theory that well myself, so maybe e5 is very, very strong. We'll have to investigate after the game. So I'm anticipating black castling, and then already e5 looks quite a bit stronger than it did on the previous move. Happy Bishop, you're asking bishop takes d6, but that blunders a bishop. Just bishop takes d6. Black defends that square twice, and we're attacking it twice, so we can't take. So a lot depends on how black plays in this position. Our opponent is settling into a think. Apart from e5, which kind of blasts open the center and we've been discussing. Okay, never mind. You see, black plays a move, and that completely changes the landscape of the position. And just intuitively, it seems to me that black really cannot get away with this move. What is the drawback of the move e5? Well, we've already discussed it, right? It opens up the diagonal for the bishop, and it also creates a big, big hole on d5. But we need to be very careful how we respond to a move like that, because I think a lot of players here fall for something very, very tempting without really calculating it. So one option that many of you are pointing out is a sacrifice, right? We can play bishop takes f7 check, that comes to mind. And the idea is to drive the king out into the open and also to potentially exploit a discovered attack against black's queen. So let's try to estimate how that line could potentially go. So let's say we play bishop takes f7, king takes f7. Well, how could we continue in that position? How could we continue in that position? Could we try to exploit perhaps the discovery against the black queen? Yeah, we could throw in a check on g5, but I would also argue that that check on g5 isn't going anywhere. We don't have to give it immediately. So what I would like to do is to go takes, takes, and then to throw a knight onto d5. That attacks the queen from two different sources. And if the queen moves away, so bishop f7, king f7, knight d5, The queen is attacked by the rook, and it's also attacked by the knight. So let's say the queen moves back to d8 in that position. Then I think we give a check on g5. And then if the king moves back to e8, we have a knight on d5, we have a rook on c1. What are both of these pieces aiming at? We enter c7 with a fork. And that looks completely crushing. Now, there is one very high-level detail that I haven't mentioned yet. And is it a deal breaker? Not completely, and we're going to go for this sacrifice anyway. But I'm going to leave it unmentioned, and I wonder if you guys will be able to find it after we play knight d5. There is a resource after knight d5 that I have not mentioned, and this resource worries me a little bit. Not enough for me not to go into this line, but it's something that I would very seriously consider if I had black. Yeah, so as many of you are pointing out, it's knight d5 and then knight takes d5 in order to get as many pieces as possible for the queen. So knight d5, knight takes d5, rook takes queen, and then that knight from d5 takes the rook. So what does black get for the queen? Black gets a rook and 2 minor pieces, which is a lot. And normally that would be an immediate deal breaker. But remember that we've also driven the king out onto a super vulnerable square, and black's pieces are terribly, terribly positioned. So that complicates the story, and I think we'll still be able to use the queen there to get an advantage. So intuitively, I feel like that line is still worth going for, even if black gets a material advantage formally. So I hope the logic makes sense. Bishop takes f7 is extremely thematic. It's one of those sacrifices that if you've played this opening any amount of times, you should be aware that this is an idea that exists. Would I sack in an over-the-board game? Well, I'll punt on that question by saying that I would take a lot longer to consider a sack like this. I probably would, but I would take a lot longer to consider this move and to consider the follow-up. And many times, we could have also just dropped our bishop back to e3. There would have been nothing wrong with just a more measured approach, and we would have gotten what we wanted out of the position. We would have had the d5 square in a fantastic position, great compensation, but this is a chance that will not present itself again, because on the next move, black would have almost certainly castled, and then we would have had to slow roll the position. So this is the kind of move that you should play now or never. So I have an interesting observation, which is that after king takes f7, I've been reflecting on that position, and I don't really know what black is thinking about. It's not like king f8 is possible here. So after king takes f7, I'm actually starting to think that knight g5 check is a better move than knight d5. Yeah, so Renko Gambit, at the end of that line, black has knight e6. So king takes f7, knight d5, knight takes d5 is what we're calculating. Rook takes queen, knight takes rook, and then some of you are noticing that there's a knight on c7 and a king on f7. Queen c4 check forks the knight and the king. But when you fork a knight, you have to be especially careful that that same knight cannot move in and block the check. And in that final position, what move does black have? Yeah, knight e6. Black has knight c7 to e6 covering the check. And it looks like black is holding everything together. And I'll show all of these lines after the game. So if you're not following, don't worry. Don't exit out of the stream. I'll show everything over the board after the game. Right now, it's just that I can't move pieces. So I have to do stuff. We have to do stuff in our head. But back to what I was saying. King takes f7. I actually like the idea of giving a check on g5. And then once the king drops back to e8, we have an option in addition to playing knight d5. We don't actually have to play knight d5. What is an alternative in that position? So we actually have at least two alternatives. We have knight e6, which many of you are pointing out. We can worm our way into e6, and we're also forking the queen and the g7 pawn. But we have another very interesting option. We have the option of going knight b5. Not knight d5, but knight b5. And the great thing about knight b5 is that black doesn't have the same idea as he does after knight d5, right? After knight d5, black can take on d5 and then take the rook with that knight. But after knight b5, black can't even get the same amount of material for the queen. Okay, he kind of can, but not in the same way. And the great thing about knight b5 is that we are still going for c7. So we will still be able to access the promised land if the queen moves away, but this time without allowing the extra option of black sacrificing for the queen. Notice how much thinking I've already done here. King takes f7 finally, and I think we can very safely go for that option. So let's begin with the move. Let's begin with the move knight g5 check, forcing the king to decide where it wants to go. Forcing the king to decide where it wants to go. Now, some of you are like, well, what about king f8? Well, king f8 walks into a fork, knight e6 check. King e8 quickly. And this is a critical moment. So now knight d5 is really, really bad. Because after knight takes d5, rook takes queen, knight takes rook, the king on e8 is quite safe. If we had wanted to go for that line, we should have done so on the previous move. We should have kept the king on f7. But to reiterate the main point that I noticed here, we don't have to go knight d5. We have another way of achieving the same idea without the drawbacks, and that is knight c3 to b5. Again, we hit the queen from two different directions. It's a double attack on the queen, which means that the only way for black to save the queen is to move it. Just like if there was a king on c7. It's the same principle, right? So black can, if he wants, give up the queen for a rook and a piece. And black is already up a piece, so that would make it a rook and two minor pieces. Queen takes c1. But after queen takes c1, don't rush to assume that you have to recapture the queen. I think the key insight that I made is I noticed that we have an intermediate move after queen takes c1 that changes everything. This knight is already going to be lost, so we might as well give it up for the maximum amount of material. Knight takes d6 check. Okay, bishop takes d6. And then what do you recapture the queen with? The rook or the bishop in that resulting position? You take with the bishop. You take with the bishop because remember the bishop is hanging. You take with the bishop, and how do we evaluate the resulting position? Well, what we've done by playing knight takes d6 check is not only won a pawn, right? We've won a pawn, which is great, but we have opened up the d file. And in a position like this, where black is as passive as he is, opening up files is the difference between consolidation and a crushing attack. And there it is. We go down that line. So not bishop takes c1, which allows black to take on b5 and keep his center intact, making the king a lot safer. We start by taking on d6 with check. Now, bishop takes d6 is forced because, like, why would black not take it if he has the chance to take it? Well, we have an extra queen, but black has a rook and two minor pieces. So technically, black is up material here. Not a lot, but some. But I think we're completely winning. I think we're completely winning. Bishop takes queen. Again, why not rook takes queen? Because that would have just hung the bishop on f4, which is now hanging. And we get this position. How do I know that we're winning? Well, I know that we're winning because we have several ideas that I think black has no answer to. What are these ideas? And after king e7, I think we can execute one of them, which essentially just wins the game on the spot. So what I'm noticing here is that our main attacker is the knight, right? Our knight seems to be our biggest asset. Our rook is also a huge asset. So some of you might notice the idea of taking on d6 and playing knight f7 check and then knight takes h8, and that would win a piece. The drawback of that continuation is that we would essentially be cashing in our attack for an extra piece. That's completely winning. But maybe the knight could conceivably get trapped in that final position, and that's a little bit messy. So let's see if we can find something a little bit cleaner. What is the knight exactly doing? Well, the knight on its own is not really ready to move into any of these squares, but perhaps we could use the queen for assistance. How could we do that? Well, as many of you are pointing out, queen c4, I think, is just absolutely crushing because you are creating essentially a double attack. You're threatening queen e6 check, and you're threatening queen f7 check, which is incidentally a mate threat. Queen f7 check, and then knight e6 is literally checkmate. And I've quickly determined that black has no way to defend both of these squares at the same time. Black can defend each one of them on their own, like rook f8, but then we'd give a check on e6. Or if black moves the knight away to defend d6, then we play queen f7. And also, when we play queen f7, the king has to move back, And if necessary, we could simply take the bishop on d6 and we'd be totally winning. And the game is over. That's how quickly the attack happens and crushes. But there was a lot that was involved in finding these moves. There was a lot that was involved in not going down the wrong line. And I think when you look at games like this, like these, and queen f7 check, of course, not queen e6, because black's defended that square. But now we play queen f7, and then we take on d6, and the game is over. When you look at games like these, you think, well, the attack was very straightforward. That was super simple. Not much happened. But hopefully you're able to see now that behind the scenes, there's a ton of calculation that has to happen. And the hardest thing is to actually reject the wrong lines, the lines that look tempting, but allow a particular defense. But the game is not over. Let's finish this off. So what is the most effective and efficient way of ending the game? So you can essentially take two approaches in a position like this. The first approach is just to take a bunch of pieces. The first approach is just to play queen takes g7 and hit the rook and the knight, and then you win the knight and you win the game. The second approach is to aim for checkmate and to try to use your remaining pieces, and this is the approach that I usually prefer. So there's a very calm move, and how do I find this move? Well, I find this move because I know that we still have a piece that is not in the game. Our bishop on c1 is still dormant. And the move that comes to mind is bishop e3. A lot of you are proposing knight e6 check. I don't like that move. It's fancy, and you're attracted to it because you're using the pin. But ask yourself what it actually achieves. Knight e6 check, knight takes e6, queen takes e6. Do you even have a threat there? Yeah, I understand that your opponent can't take your queen and you feel cool, but you don't have a threat. And you're trading in your main attacker for nebulous reasons. So, advantage of bishop e3 over bishop d2. Well, it's the fact that we're actually attacking the knight. Bishop e3 creates a threat. Bishop d2 doesn't. So, we're simply threatening to take the knight, and we're also keeping all of our pieces on their prime attacking locations. Pawn b4 would have worked, but it wouldn't have brought the bishop into the game. So, I like this move even more than b4. Again, we're completely winning, and you shouldn't look at this and say, oh, I didn't see bishop e3, I suck at attacking. A gazillion different moves win, and I would recommend most people to just play queen takes g7. I would recommend most people just to take queen takes g7 and take the knight and end the game. But I want to try to be as precise as possible, because that's the philosophy behind the speedrun. Is I don't shy away from making moves that I'd be making over the board just because they're a little bit more complicated. And again, notice how I'm always defaulting to involving as many pieces as possible in the attack, right? A move that activates a piece and brings it into the game is rarely going to be bad in any position. So it's just something that you can default to if you're not sure what to do. h6, that's a good move. That's a good move. And I think we're unfortunately going to have to... Oh, actually, no, I see a mate. I see a mate. And a very nice mate, actually. So let's start by taking the knight. Let's start by taking the knight and eliminating it, moving it off the board. So after h takes g5, who can spot the mating sequence? There's a very, very nice mating sequence. It starts with a check. It starts with a check. It starts with a move that I know all of you are seeing, which is bishop b6 check. And how do I see this? Well, the reason I see this is because I noticed that a queen could land on c7, and that is checkmate. If a queen lands on c7, that's mate. So what move comes to mind? Well, how can the queen get to c7? Well, it can get to c7 via c4. But after queen c4, black can block the check with the bishop. Hopefully you noticed that as well, bishop c6. But if you understand what you're aiming for, then the move should be very easy after that. Queen c4 check, bishop c6. You just play rook takes c6 check. You break through, bc, queen takes c6 check, king b8, and then queen c7 is checkmate. You identify the target square, and then you chart the course to that square. Queen c4 check is over. Very straightforward logic. And solving a ton of exercises is going to help you find these mates quickly and efficiently. And here's another interesting point. It's not like I saw something specific that allowed me to see queen c4. I'm breaking this down for you logically, but that's not how I found the move. I found it, the move just occurred to me. The move just occurred to me sort of automatically. because it's just pattern recognition, right? It's just complete pattern recognition. Queen c4, queen c7. I've maybe seen this idea a gazillion times, and it's almost like your multiplication tables. And that's something you have to understand, which is that if you solve a certain amount of exercises and at a certain experience level, you'll just start seeing ideas like this automatically. Even if it seems right now that you're never going to reach that point, you have to trust that you'll get to a point where you will see this stuff super, super quickly. And that's what makes chess training sometimes such a thankless task, because you don't even really know what you're aiming for. You don't really see results immediately, but you have to trust that eventually this is going to create an impact. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, that was a nice game. I'm going to check Mark's book to make sure that we played correctly. All right, we got it. Loot secured. So this is Mark Esserman's book on the Smith Morra, which I highly recommend. It's called Mayhem in the Morra. E6, knight f3 is correct. Then a6. Let's see if that's analyzed. So it is analyzed. E6 and a6, we correctly played bishop c4. And then I think Mark does not look at the move bishop e7, but what he does look at is d6, castles, and knight c6, which is a line. But putting the bishop on e7 first is really, really weird. Like, bishop e7 is just passive. That was a step in the wrong direction. And then after d6, we play our typical configuration. We play queen e2. Now, the important thing to understand about this position is that if black plays knight c6, then it kind of transposes to a pretty well-known line. Here you play rook d1, and this reaches a theoretical position, which Mark analyzes in his book. But the move knight d7, there are no games in the database. This is a very, very strange move. And this is a strange move because it's just passive, right? Developing the knight to d7 is very, very passive. And it increases the effectiveness of rook d1. So I see 4 games in the database at this point. And queen c7, I think, is another mistake. Knight gf6 is how the 4 games continued. And now 2 games went e5. d-e5, knight takes e5. And you can just see the amount of pressure that you're putting on black's position here. So anyways, black plays queen c7. We play bishop f4. Oh, and interestingly, in this position, there are 20 games in the database. So perhaps we clearly transposed to some sort of a line. And all 20 games continued knight e5. Oh, apparently this is a line. Apparently this is a line. Knight e5, bishop takes e5, d-e5, rook a-c1. Still looks really, really good for... This position just looks really, really, really good for white. This position just looks really, really good for white. Knight e5, bishop e5, d-e5, rook a-c1, queen b8. Oh, and then bishop b5 check has been played. Oh, Maria did commentary for Nemo. And then you got this position in 2 games. And this is just freaking awesome. This is just awesome. f6, knight c7, f7, knight a8, queen a8, rook c7. And this is just totally and absolutely crushing. Just curious what game this was. Torre against Tasic from 1974. Damn girl, 1974. So this line has been around for a very long time. 2 2200s, and white crushed him in this game. Okay, so knight gf6. Now we play rook ac1. Everything I did here should be obvious. And what I'm really curious about is whether bishop takes f7 is the top engine move. Let's test it out. Is bishop takes f7 the top engine move? Let's see. I doubt that it is, but I also wouldn't rule it out. I feel like it's so powerful. Okay. It is the second move. And the top move is a version of it. Oh, we just had knight b5. Knight b5 is very, very strong here. Oh, and look at this. This is sick. If queen b8, okay, if a takes b5, you play bishop takes f7 check, and then you win the queen, right? That's easy. That's easy. But if queen b8, this is what I missed. We have knight c7 check anyway. And I've seen this concept before, dragging the queen back to c7, and then we play bishop f7 again. And if black moves the king, oh my god, then the top move is bishop takes f7 here. But this is a much, much better version of the sacrifice than we had. This is like what I did, except we have a knight frickin' already on c7. But this isn't even close. Queen c4 check and knight g5, and it's crushing. So that was a cool idea. We had knight b5 first, and then knight c7, and then bishop takes f7. So we took immediately, which is good, but not as convincing. And the reason it's not as convincing, knight g5 is correct. And the reason it's not as convincing is because of king g6, which I saw. Oh, and the idea that we discussed, knight d5. So if the queen moves, then black loses. But black has this knight takes d5 resource that I was talking about during the game. Oh my god. And look at this. White's top move is not rook takes queen. It's knight e6. What a move. Knight e6. So you're attacking the queen from a second source. And if the queen drops back, then you get checkmated after queen g4. Oh my god, you sack a third piece. King f7. Queen takes g7. E d5, king f5, and this is checkmate because the king is way too exposed. Simply beautiful. For example, bishop f6, oh my god, look at this mate! King e4, the mate in 2 is king g2. Oh my god, that's amazing. Bishop g7, f3 is checkmate. Holy smokes. And look at what the second best move is. Queen takes h7. Oh my god, this is still mate. Oh, and you sacked the bishop too. Oh my god, look at this mate. You're down a queen and 3 pieces. I mean, this is why the Morra is such an amazing opening. Like, these are the kinds of ideas that you get. This is like freaking amazing. You can even checkmate without the bishop. Imagine if we had this. Yeah, that would have been insane. And you can also mate with the move g4 check. Sack the bishop. But this is all very easy. I mean, you should understand why this is mate. Just because the king is so wide open. Look at black's pieces. Black has nothing in the defense. So this should not be surprising that these lines exist. e4, rook e4. I mean, there's sacrifices everywhere. So that's incredible. And that means knight e6 is the only way to gain an advantage here. According to the engine, if you take the queen hastily, then after knight c7, the position is completely unclear. It's equal. In fact, white has to be careful because white's got both minor pieces are hanging. Incredible, incredible lines. King g6 would have been the most resilient move for black. So our opponent played king e8, and now we correctly found knight b5. Okay, so according to the engine, oh, we still had this idea. Knight takes d5, knight e6. I mean, this move was like completely not on my radar. Knight e6 not taking the queen. Okay, so let's say queen b6. What's the idea here? Oh, it's knight g7. King f7. If king d8, by the way, there's a checkmate in 2 moves. Check and mate, which is kind of nice. So king f7, we sack another piece with queen h5. Bishop h6 check. Oh, and here the attack is pretty pedestrian. We play rook d3 and lift the rook up to g3. Knight f4, rook g3, knight g6, rook g6 is the classic. hg, queen g6 is checkmate. Incredible. I mean, sacks everywhere. So many attackers. So I played knight b5, which is good. Queen c1, and now look at the engine. Only move knight takes d6 check. Rook c1 was an advantage, but not nearly as convincing. So this is the secret sauce. Knight takes d6 check, and then bishop takes c1. And it's +2. It's actually not as winning as I thought it would be. But the only move to keep it at +2 is h6, which is a really hard move to play. Because it looks like it actually forces the knight onto a square that we want to go to anyway. But very computerish idea. King e7. You give up g7, and then you go knight c5 to control the f5 square with the bishop. So that knight f5 check you can take on f5. So black holds on in this position, and black can defend. But for a human, I think it's impossible. Okay, so once our opponent played king e7, the game is over. Queen c4. And look at how much better queen c4 is than rook takes d6. It's not even close, because queen c4 goes for checkmate. Knight c5, queen f7 check, king d8, and now it's +12. Okay, so bishop e3 is good. Queen takes g7 is technically the top move, but bishop e3 is also very good. h6, and now bishop c5 is correct. Check. Okay, rook f6 is mate in 5. Takes, Wow, queen d5 simply. Look at this. And then queen d6 and queen c7 is unstoppable. Black literally, you can literally pre-move those moves, basically. But we went mate in 5, which is good enough. Because if king b8 would have staved it off a little bit longer. But who cares? Who cares? And then it's mate. What does the computer say about knight e6 check? When? I'm not sure when you're talking about. Wow. And that's the game, ladies and gentlemen. But I want you to notice something, which is that look at how many problems were caused by the fact that our opponent developed the knight to d7 rather than c6. If the knight had been on c6, none of this would have worked. There wouldn't have been the c-file x-ray. And most importantly, the e6 square would have been protected by the bishop. So tons of problems stemmed from the fact that this knight on d7 was interfering with black's entire construction. So can the engine save black's position? Yeah, I don't think I would beat the engine from this position. I don't think Magnus... Okay, with Magnus it would probably be 50-50. The engine can basically save any position that is probably +2 and below. The engine will probably save this position against me in like a classical game. But it doesn't matter. You have to evaluate positions based on human understanding. And this line is simply incredible. King g6. So you start with knight d5. This is understandable. But after knight takes d5, I think the highlight of this analysis is knight e6. That's just such a sexy move. You don't take the queen, and instead you go for checkmate. You prepare queen g4 check. Knight f4, by the way. Oh, knight f4, you just play knight takes f4, and then rook takes c7 with overwhelming position. Oh my god. Any questions? Well, the browser engine is weak, but it's good enough, right? It gives us a pretty decent perspective on what the ballpark evaluation is. We're not looking here for a scientific evaluation. We're looking for a ballpark estimate of what the eval is. And for that, like depth 20 is perfectly sufficient. We don't need like a supercomputer. You understand what I'm saying? Well, I explained why it's only +2. +2 is a lot. +2 is basically borderline winning. But the reason it's quote-unquote only +2 is because black gets a ton of pieces for the queen. And there is no forced checkmate. So after knight d5, knight d5, knight e6, black has this defensive move knight c5, which is a really, really nice move. And if knight takes queen, then black takes on f4 and attacks white's queen. Bishop defends g4, so you don't have that check. And black has 3 pieces for the queen. So knight c5 is not a move that I think most humans would even think about, but it's the only way to get a reasonable play. And notice how white's best move here isn't even to take the queen. It's queen g4, queen takes g7, giving up the knight, and then going for this position, ef4. Black has 3 pieces for a rook, but you're going to win one of them back, and the king is just totally busted here. So, well, Aksenia, I would qualify that statement. +2 is not nothing under 1500. It depends on what kind of +2 it is. If you have a kind of +2 that's an extra piece in an endgame, then I would say it's pretty safe. But a position like this, of course, is still anyone's game like under 1500. Because it's so chaotic that you can expect a lot of mistakes among beginner to intermediate players. But how much stronger is ChessBase's engine compared to Browserfish? So there's something you have to understand, which is that the engines themselves are not different on ChessBase and on chess.com. It's the speed that's different. It's the speed at which it reaches a higher depth. Now, at the same depth, this Stockfish and the ChessBase Stockfish give the same thing. It's just that it just took this Stockfish maybe 3 minutes to reach depth 28. And if I load it on ChessBase, it uses more resources, so it'll reach depth 28 maybe in 15 seconds. So it's just much more efficient to analyze with the ChessBase Stockfish because it reaches a higher depth much faster, and you're able to access and get to a lot more positions at a higher depth. So the dictionary definition of +2 is like 2 pawns up. That's the equivalent of 2 pawns up. But clearly in this position, white is not 2 pawns up. +2 can also signify an advantage that comes from other sources, such as a decisive attack or a more positional advantage. You cannot always quantify exactly why a certain evaluation is what it is. If it was as easy as that, then chess would not be a difficult game. In many cases, you look at a position, even GM looks at a position and says, I don't understand why this is +4. Sometimes I don't even understand why something is like +7, in extreme cases. But the reasoning could be very subtle. Like, oh, there's some sort of threat, and that threat is unstoppable, but you don't know what that threat is until you analyze the position. So evals can be easy to understand. If you're up a piece and you see that it's +5, you're like, well, it's because you're up a piece. Sometimes evals are a lot harder to understand. And it's a good practice to try to figure out why the engine eval is what it is and try to verbalize and analyze until you figure it out. Winning an exchange, again, but you can't take that in a vacuum, because what if it's an exchange sacrifice for full compensation? Yeah, winning an exchange without compensation in most cases, you could probably peg that at approximately +2, +2.5. But it completely depends on, like, the context. Like, is it a middle game? If you win an exchange in an end game, it can be +10. Okay, we can do more questions. I'm enjoying this. Yeah, and that's another thing that I want people to understand. Sometimes you bring up a great point. You could have a position that's +11 or +7. But the reason that it's +7 is not because you're up a queen. It's because you have a forced sequence, and this sequence results in a checkmate or results in a winning position. But if you don't find the sequence, then the next best move is, let's say, equality, right? And a lot of times people get really mad at themselves, like, oh, I was +11. Well, that's a meaningless statement. It's not that you were +11. It's just that you had a win and you didn't find the win. And, if you didn't find the win, then the second best move led to equality. What is this? 7-8 to 96 with a 5 subs. Let's go. Thank you. I can give you an example of that. I can give you many examples of that from my career. Examples of positions in which if you don't find the best move, then the evaluation drops precipitously to, to whatever it is. Here's a good example. I have something in mind. No, it feels terrible to miss a win. That's one of the worst feelings in chess. So here's a great example. A position that I botched, which is +13. Okay, so this position, ladies and gentlemen, this is from one of my games in 2012. Now, this was a big game. If I had won this game, I would have been in a great position for a GM norm. You can notice that I lost. I lost in the end. So it's white to play. And I will spare you I won't necessarily treat this as an exercise. I'll just show you what happens. So basically I'm winning in one move. The winning line here, but there is only one winning line. And the winning line is to play bishop takes f5. So you start by taking the knight. And the reason that you want to take the knight is the knight was defending the g3 square. And why is that important that the knight was defending the g3 square? Because you can play the move rook g3 now. Thank you, David Kozmar, gifting a sub. Why is rook g3 so overwhelming? Well, because it threatens checkmate on g8. Why is that dangerous? Because black cannot defend against it. Black's pieces are way too discombobulated. The only thing black can try is to put a piece in the middle of the rook and the queen. So black can try knight g5. But now, what should white do? What is the fastest path to checkmate here? The only piece that can defend... Yeah, exactly. So you move the bishop, but what do you do with it? I mean, the simplest is bishop takes g5. You just take the knight. You take the knight. Thank you, Valor May, with the 2 subs. F takes g5, and back to h3 you go. And you deliver ladder checkmate. Rook h7, rook takes h7 mate. So you use the g file, and then you transition back to the h file after black plays knight g5. But let's turn on the engine and see what's going on. It might seem in a position like this that there are like 4 or 5 different winning sequences. And that's kind of what I thought. I thought, anything is winning. And I played a move within like a minute. But if you actually look at the Stockfish eval, let me resize this a little bit so you can see. Notice that bishop takes f5 is literally like +15. It's basically checkmate. But if we add a line, the second best move is some ridiculous bishop e3 move that equalizes. And if we add another line, the third best move is going to be winning for black. And that is the move that I played. I played the terrible e takes f6. My thinking was that I was preparing bishop g7 check, which I thought was mating. And I completely missed queen takes b2. Why is that even a defense? Because after bishop g7 check, which I played, black plays rook takes g7, and I forgot that the queen was actually defending the g7 square. F takes g7, and queen takes g7 defends against all of the threats, and it forces a queen trade to make matters worse because the rook in the corner is hanging. So white has to trade queens, and black is winning in this endgame because he's got 2 pieces for a rook and a huge pawn center, etc. And black ended up winning. Why not rook takes h7? At which point could you have played rook h7? Yeah, they had us playing on Christmas. That was it. Well, this is like a Christmas and New Year's tournament. Yeah, well, g4 doesn't quite work because of knight g5. Sadly, that doesn't work out. But yeah, rook h7 and g4 is interesting, but black has this move rook c3, and after rook d1, black moves the king away, gf, and bishop h5. Remember that black is basically also, rook d2, e5. And this endgame is just winning for black. It's not the material that matters. It's the fact that black has these connected passers and white's position is in shambles. So nothing can save white in this position. My opponent ended up mating me with knight and bishop, which is kind of funny. Yeah, I've shown this position before, but in a different context. So I lost a lot of sleep that night, especially when I realized that I missed. I realized that I missed this win on the way home. I didn't even check with the engine. I literally was thinking about the game, and I was like, I must have missed a mate somewhere. And then it just occurred to me I could have taken an f5 and gone rook g3. It's one of the most infuriating sensations because you were literally that close. One move and the game would have been over. But that's just life. Like you got to accept that as part of your chess journey. You're gonna have games like that, and there's just not much you can do about it. You're gonna screw things up. But the reason I was showing this in the first place is to demonstrate an example of. You could tell your friend, oh, I was plus 13 and I didn't win, but that would be disingenuous. It was less that and more that you just had one win, and if you didn't find it, you were basically lost, right? Black is better after g takes f6. Yeah, that move doesn't just relinquish the win. It actually gives black a winning position. Yeah, so that's another thing. A great point. In many cases, it's plus 11, but you find a line which simplifies to a position that you know is very easy to win. But the engine doesn't think in terms of what's easier to win. The engine thinks very materialistically. So sometimes you give up, let's say, a queen for a rook to simplify to a position where you just have a rook. And then the engine says that's a blunder. And you understand that you have to take such things with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean it's actually a blunder in human terms. It might just be the most prudent option. Even if, according to the engine, it brought the evaluation down because, for example, you gave up some material. So you just have to use your common sense rather than just looking at what the engine says and just automatically assuming that whatever the engine says is biblical knowledge. Sometimes you actually can be smarter than the engine, especially in the event of like a line which simplifies to a much easier position to win. Yeah, I know people don't have common sense these days, but you can still use it in chess. Okay, guys, I think I'm going to call it a night. I'm getting tired. Today has been a very good day.